Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Able Voices podcast. I'm Dr. Rhoda Bernard, founding managing director of the Berklee Institute for Accessible Arts Education and the assistant chair of the music education department at Berklee College of Music. And I am proud to present this podcast featuring disabled artists and arts educators. We are inviting artists with disabilities to be guest hosts for the Able Voices podcast. Today's guest host is Jeremy Andrew Davis. Jeremy Andrew Davis is a multi-hyphenate writer, film director, disability advocate and representation consultant, entrepreneur, and social media content creator. He is on a mission to transform disability representation, shaping the cultures of tomorrow through the stories of today. Jeremy draws on his neurodivergent, multi-disabled, non-binary identity to broaden society's cultural horizons through epic stories that immerse audiences into the experiences of marginalized people who must odyssey through a hostile world to demonstrate their power.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeremy Andrew Davis, your guest host for this Able Voices podcast episode. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you to Kaedyn Nedopak. Kaedyn is known as the Trans Fairy Prince on social media. He is an award-winning queer transgender producer, author, podcast host, speaker, and creative activist who uses his art to inspire others and activate social change. Kaedyn, welcome to the Able Voices podcast.
Hello, Jeremy. How are you today?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm good. It's Friday, and I am about to launch this Kickstarter, so my brain's a little fried, but I am excited to be here.
Yes, that is one of the things that I was going to talk to you about today. Kaedyn has an incredible book series coming out. I have a bit of a behind-the-scenes view for this, and I cannot wait for you to be able to share more about this book with the audience. So tell our listeners what you got going on.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think I want to say thank you to you, Jeremy, because I had you read some of the early chapters and you gave me so much incredible feedback. So you really do have an exclusive inside view of what I'm writing into Kaedyn's head. But, that's the crazy part about doing a Kickstarter for a novel is that nobody's ever read it before except your few readers. And so part of the creation is actually pitching the book. So, we can talk about the book and what it's about, but I just find myself in these two modes, right? There's the writing of the book and the creating of the story and the plot and the characters. I've been doing that for 8 years. But then there's the creation of the Kickstarter, which is a product. We have to design the book. We have to sell the book. We kind of have to pitch it to people that have never seen it before. And it's just like these two parts of my brain are just like all in. So let me tell you a little bit about my story. The trilogy is called Charlie's Song. And the tagline is a transgender boy destined to heal an empire with storm magic. It is about an 18-year-old boy and a group of other LGBTQ teens. I would say it's definitely a cast, a full cast. And these teens have to work through a lot of systemic and personal trauma in the era that this takes place in 1848 in order to find their self-power and kind of fight the empire. One of the taglines is like revolution against empire. You have little arrows that point to the book saying like, here's what it's about. And it's like queer romance, magic. And then that's my favorite one, revolution against empire.
I love
And
it.
I think that it's really a story about a group of teens who are trying to figure themselves out. They're trying, whether they're dealing with sexism or homophobia, most of them are queer and trans because that's me, that's my community. I really wanted to create a story where people that never get to see themselves as humanity's heroes are the protagonists. And that does include people with unseen and seen disabilities, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, being neurodivergent and such. But essentially, these group of teens are trying to figure out how to become more free under this imperial rule of this empire. And there's a whole trilogy where a whole bunch of stuff happens. I'm going to say a huge event happens that causes a catastrophic division between the rich and the poor, as we've seen throughout history. And it puts everyone in a precarious situation where we really get to see what humans do when resources are limited. Let me put it that way. And so these teens are trying to deal with their own personal traumas, their identities, while dealing with this larger story that is this crushing empire, basically, stealing all the food, I guess. That's a big one. I don't want to give too much away.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, we'll leave
Well,
it at that. At that.
yeah. One of the things that I loved about this, like for the listeners, Kaedyn and I have been Facebook friends and had conversations over years. So
We're
like,
friends, Jeremy. We're just friends.
yeah, we're beyond Facebook friends.
Yeah.
But when you posted about this story that you were writing, I was just hooked because I love this idea of it being historical, but with this fantasy layer added on. So you take us to a time where we have a reference of like, oh,
Yeah.
that's kind of what I pictured life to be like back then. But then there's magic and all these other elements added in that just spice up the story so much. And then you layer it in with the cultural and systemic issues that you already talked about that you're
Mhm.
addressing, and then giving trans and LGBTQIA plus community that power and them being heroes in this time period. It's wonderful.
Thank you. I do have to thank my father, because I grew up at the dinner table talking about politics every single day. I mean, I wouldn't say
Mm.
I was interested at that point, but my father he's a very big Democrat. He is very anti-tradition and conservative roles, and so is my mom. They were both very free and open. In fact, they really grew up, kind of just violently abused by the Catholic Church and
Mm.
Christianity. During that time, my grandparents were all immigrants. They came over from Poland, from Ukraine, from Ireland, and they were very religious. And my parents grew up with that, with all those gender norms. And they really tried their best to not teach those to us. So my father was always like, here's what's happening, screw Reagan. All the rich are trying to take our money. And I really grew up with this embedded into my mind and my psyche. And he was in love with history. He would constantly watch the History Channel. Meanwhile, my mother was like the escapist. She loved fantasy and vampires and Lord of the Rings. So I had these two sides of me that were just constantly interested in, like, oh, there's the real world, but then there's the imaginary world. And then come to find out, through my own spiritual awakening, that I don't think some of this magic that we think is imaginary is really imaginary at all. And so I've tried to incorporate that into the story, where it primarily is a historical story. It is about the era of 1848, during the Age of Revolutions. This was
Mm.
an era where France is coming into its second revolution. And this era is an era of time when every country in the world was fighting against monarchies and dictatorships and authoritative, governments. And so people wanted freedom, people wanted choices, and this was the era where France sort of kickstarted this entire thing, and that's the era that this story takes place in. And so in my imaginary land of Doria, it takes place in the real world, but I kind of wanted to have my own culture so I could create my own
Mhm.
story. But in my imaginary world, these people are influenced by this French Revolution, and they're like, oh, well, if France could do it, I mean, this is what everybody was thinking at the time. If France could do it, we could do this. And so this definitely has that revolutionary feel. But at the same time, there's a goddess, there's a god stuck in human form. I'm going to give a spoiler right there. That's a main character. And so there is a little bit of mythology and magic, maybe more of like magical realism, but there's definitely
I
a lot
love
of like
it.
connection to nature. And, the main character has storm magic. So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So I know some of the history of how this story has evolved and come to be in novel form.
Mhm.
Tell us about that.
Oh, yes, this is such a long process. So I tell people I've been working on this for 8 years. It's gonna be 9 years by the time it comes out, and I started this project right at the tail end of me creating an award show. I created an award show called The Geekies, which I'm sure you know about, and
Mhm.
I was kind of trying to get out of Hollywood. It was just too toxic for me. I knew that I was meant for something more. And this was 2016 was the last show that I did. And I decided after that show, it just took such a heavy toll on me
Yeah.
that I couldn't do it anymore. But at the same time, during the entire time I was doing the Geeky Awards, I was going through a very intense spiritual awakening. I had my, what some call the Kundalini experience, the awakening, where I started practicing witchcraft. My body was breaking down. I was just really not in tune with like my purpose in this world. And so in 2016, I went on a family trip to Ireland for the first time ever. And I met
Wow.
this guy named Jonathan Beaumont. Oh my gosh, and there's this funny story about him. And he was a tour guide and he was obsessed in a good way with the Irish famine. Like he was so knowledgeable. He was a historian. He wasn't just a guide. He knew everything. He wrote books about it. He was such a powerhouse with knowledge. And after that experience, after learning about the famine, because part of my family is Irish, I was blown away with the stuff that I did not know. We know the
Mhm.
basics, but I didn't know the basics. Well, that led into me looking into Ukrainian side of my family and the Holodomor famine that they went through in the 1900s. And it really kind of kickstarted this idea of like, wow, there's a story here. Like, I feel like I want to tell this story, but I didn't realize that I would be telling a story. I know that sounds strange, but I was obsessed with the story. And then suddenly, because I had this spiritual awakening, I started working with gods and goddesses on my own. These story elements started coming to me. They were, like, floating in at, like, 2 o'clock in the morning. I would wake up every single night in the middle of the night, and I would just be flooded with, like, characters, people talking to me, ideas, scenes, and I just started writing them down. I have, like, an Evernote notebook that I think has, like, 1,000 or so notes in it, and it's just I'm writing this down, and I'm figuring out what is it that I'm doing. So
Yeah.
fast forward to the end of the year, and Trump becomes president, and what a nightmare that was. And this I decided, you know what? I think I'm writing a film. So I wrote a film. It was terrible. It was short. I didn't have enough room in
Yep.
120 pages. So I decided it was gonna be a TV show. I spent several years writing pilots, winning awards for them, pitching it as a show. And it came to a point where a bunch of producers, every producer meeting I had, they said, "We love this, but we're not gonna work with you because who are you? Like, we're gonna take this, we're gonna buy it, we're gonna basically kick you off the project." And a very dear producer friend, Mark Ordesky, who worked on Lord of the Rings, had a phone call with me, and he was very blunt, and he said, "Kaedyn," I won't use my old name. He said, "Kaedyn,
Mhm.
if you really wanna do this, you've gotta turn it into a book so that you own the IP, and then you gotta come back later and pitch it as a show." And I was like, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? You want me to do another thing? Like, I just spent all
Yep.
this time pitching it," but I knew it. I immediately knew it was the right thing to do. I'm such an avid book reader, and that was 2019, and, that's when the book idea came, and of course, it went through the pandemic, and there was a lot of me coming out as trans, and it's been quite a journey.
Yeah. And like every step along the way, I'm like, oh, I resonate with that. Like I wrote a screenplay that was too long, and I'm like, this needs to be a TV show, and then
Yes.
now I'm writing the novel, and yeah.
Who writes
Oh,
films these days? I think if you're neurodivergent, it's, like, impossible not to write something epic because our
right?
brains,
Yes.
right? Like, our brains are so complex that I could not, for the life of me, simplify this story. I just kept adding things and characters and mystery, and, of course, you gotta keep track of it all and hope that readers and editors can help you, hone it in, but that's how our brains work. Our brains are so good with complex systems that something like a film is almost too kiddie for me.
Yeah. It's like, well, that was a blip. I couldn't get to the deep stuff.
Exactly, and they're
Yeah.
kind of meant, I mean, not all films are blips, some of them are very well done, but I
Right.
do feel like I feel like most of them are a one idea, one note idea that the artistic direction is what really makes the film, right? The director's vision, but the story is always simple, and I'm not really good at simple.
Yeah. It kinda reminds me of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was like, "I want to invent a language, so I need to create the mythology behind it, because without a mythology, you don't have language." And then he wrote it, and then people were like, "You should publish that as a book." And he's like, "What? I did this for myself."
Oh my gosh, and Token is such an inspiration for me because I constantly was getting messages from my guides like, "You are creating Lord of the Rings." Okay, I wanna say that, I am not creating Lord of the Rings, I am not trying to be Token, but the
Yeah.
idea was that I had initially wrote it was 1 book, and I think that they were trying to tell me it's gonna be a trilogy, and so now it's a trilogy, and it's this world that you're inventing, and Tolkien also as a designer, I got to design the collector's edition that is going into the Kickstarter. And as a designer, Tolkien was an artist. And I
Yeah.
got to go to New York City and see his exhibition, see the
Oh, cool.
exhibition about him. And it was all of the original art that he had done for The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and all the sketches and the paintings. And I was blown away that he had created all of this, like all of his little note files with the practicing of the languages. It was incredible. So I want that. I want that for my story. I'm not inventing languages, by the way. That is beyond my neurodivergent brain. I'm gonna say that right now. I came up with like a few words that I like made up, that
Yeah.
I wanted to show because there are people in the story that they are speaking in different languages. And maybe someday, if we make that into a show, somebody can help me out with that. But that is not
Yeah,
my
like
area of
Klingon.
expertise. I was like, whoa, this is hard. Okay. Coming up with names of places is hard.
Yeah. So talk about in your creative process, like how the neurodivergence, your own flavor of neurodivergence, plays a role in that process, both like the benefits and the hardship.
Oh gosh. I'll start with the hardships because I want to end on a good note here.
I love that.
I will say, as someone who, as we talked about, being autistic and having ADHD, and I'm also dyslexic. So I'll say number one, like a lot of writers will sit down and write by hand. I can't do that. I can't write by hand. I failed penmanship when I was younger. I have a disability where I literally have difficulty forming words. So thank gosh there are, computers because everything I do is on the computer. But that's the first thing is I can't go out and take notes in nature on by hand. I have to always bring my phone with me, either do voice recordings or write things down because I physically can't. I
Yeah.
can't even read my own handwriting if I tried. I've tried to journal before that way. I was like, no one's ever reading this, including me. It's just a bunch of scribbles.
We're in the same boat.
Yeah, right. I think that's such a common thing. But the ADHD has really, it really took a long time to figure out the process of creating because of that, because you can get distracted so quickly with like your own mind. We know this, but also
Hmm.
like with what's going on in the world. There's so much trauma, there's so much bad news coming and flying at you that you're sitting there working and you happen to see a post on Instagram about something and it throws you into a tizzy and suddenly your brain and your nervous system are over functioning and you're not able to do anything and you have to quit for the day. So I've had a lot of those days where I would sit down and write and one thing would just throw me into a tizzy and I had to stop. And so that's why I think it's taking so long. Again, I started the book during the pandemic. So there was a lot of trauma. I had
Yeah.
COVID, I had family members die from COVID. I was
Mm.
coming out as transgender. So there was a lot of depression around before I came out, during, after, and when we're dealing with a lot of that stuff, our nervous system does not do well. It cannot be in creative zone all the time when you're trying to survive. So I think that's some of the downfalls. But I will say, right now, when you are in love with your story, like right now, I'm obsessed with doing this Kickstarter. When ADHD brains get into that hyper focus mode, nothing can stop us. And I am so happy that once I started the Kickstarter project, and I think this is going to last through the end of the book, I really got myself into gear, into that hyper focus mode. And I was like, hell yeah, let's do this. So I'm working like constantly. I'm barely like eating, sleeping, but
Take care of yourself.
I'm taking care of myself.
Yeah.
I am
It's
sleeping.
hard.
Yeah, but that hyper focus is great. I guess the only downfall with that is that people are like, "Where are you?" You basically like vanish because
Weird.
you're in a
Yeah.
trance, as people like to call it. But hey, you know what? That's what works for me. So I've had to set a lot of boundaries around interrupting me, around not being available because I'm working on things, whether I'm working on work or somebody needs me. Those are just the things that neurodivergent people all have to do. Boundaries And setting expectations, I think, are a very big thing, especially if you're working with a publisher, which I am not. I'm self-publishing. But if you were, you'd really have to have that conversation around deadlines because
Yeah.
those neurotypical deadlines don't work for everybody, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I come across a lot of, in writers groups and different writers organizations, those kinds of things. They're always like saying, well, here's advice. And I come across a lot of the advice that I'm like, that for me is bad advice. What are some of those things for you that you've come across, good and bad?
Oh, most of the advice for writers is poo. I mean, I gotta be honest. Look, humans made up all the rules on the planet that we have. We literally made everything up. I'm not a rule person. I've always been rebellious. So the fact that there are rules, period, I hate. I mean, look, I'm going to create sentences that make sense. I'm going to try to use grammar correctly. But when we're talking about rules of what goes into a story, I just really don't believe in a lot of them. I mean, there are things like structure I really do believe in. Having written screenplays, I believe the structure really does, having the beginning, middle, and end, that really does kind of contain the story. There's things like that that make sense. But then there's rules like, or people will say, oh, if you want to write, you got to get up really early in the morning and like get going. And I was like, wait a minute, I just slept for like 7 or 8 hours. My ADHD brain is not going to get up and sit down for another 8 hours. I can't stay still. So for
Yeah.
me, I had to just say, you know what? I'm going to write. I'm going to dedicate every single day a little bit of time to write, but I need to be flexible as to when that happens because sometimes it takes my mind a long time to wake up. I need to do other things. I need to accomplish other things during the day before I sit down and write because sometimes you're writing a new chapter, you're not going to finish it that day. And we need those
Yeah.
dopamine hits, right? So that's a big one. I would just say, oh my gosh, just there's so many rules where people are just like, you have to have this or you can't have this. Like, for example, I have several different point of view styles in my book. You start with the main character who is first person, and every other character is third person. And it
Hmm.
works, it flows, it works. So, in my mind, and by the way, I base that off of Outlander because that's what they do in the books. And I was like, oh, this is so good. It works. And hey, if it works for somebody like Diana, it's going to work for me. But you can take those things and as long as it flows, right? So even within a chapter, I don't have head hopping, but I do have segments where it's one character and goes to another character and then goes back to the other character because certain things are happening at the same time. As long as it works and it doesn't detract from the story, I say go for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But most of
Um,
those rules are neurotypical. Come on.
yeah. And
Especially around
especially like
schedules and yeah.
the writer routines.
Oh God, no. There's no
Wh-
routine. There's no
yeah.
routine for our brain.
One of the big ones that I often hear is you got to write every day. And like, I tried to do that for so many years. And yeah, you get more words on the page. But one, when I do that, I'd burn out on my story and I'd have to leave the story. And then, it goes even longer for me to finish it because I'm not listening to my body and my health. And then two, so I developed this thing for myself is I will plan to write. And some days are not writing days. Some
Mhm.
days tapping on the keyboard is not going to work. So I give myself, I can usually tell within 30 minutes if I'm going to be able to get myself into the writing group.
Exactly.
And if I'm not there, even after 15, 20 minutes, then I know that trying to force myself to continue to write is not going to be productive. And 99% of the time, what I write on that session, I'm going to trash. So I'm pushing myself too hard to try to achieve a word count goal and hoorah, I did it every day. Look at me. But the long-term gain is not there. So yeah.
Yeah, my theory on that, because I've dealt with a lot of that. that is a huge part of my experience. Is once I realized I was neurodivergent, it was the not being hard on myself for how
Yeah.
my brain works because it's beyond my control. However, I want to add to that is that sometimes you are meant to experience life. That's why stories take so long to write. That's why I think some of us are putting our heart and soul into it, because they are stories that come from our life experiences. So, for example, I had started writing the book, even though I had written all of this television stuff. I started writing the book and I changed the story around, and the main character wasn't right. And I kept struggling with it. I got to a certain point in the book where they were opening to their magic, and I was like, this is not working. Something is wrong. And then I came out and I was struggling with my own identity. I came out as transgender. And it took me that whole time to realize the main character is transgender. I need to rewrite all of this. This whole experience is actually based around this. And that was the missing element. But I
Yeah.
had to go through the coming out, the spiritual part of that, the dealing with my body, the hormones, all of that in order to have enough experience to write that character. And so sometimes life has to come in those moments. Like maybe if you can't write, maybe there's something else calling. This is what I would tell all
Yes.
writers. Maybe something else is calling you that day, because your life is not about writing. Your life has a bigger mission. Even though I'm writing this book, the story is a much bigger mission than just the novel. And sometimes you have to go out into the world and participate in your soul calling. And then you can come back to doing the writing thing, okay? And
Yeah.
that's all
Yeah.
gonna make it so much better.
Yeah, I've definitely had several times where I've gotten the idea before I was ready to write it. And like something from within is like, "Oh, I this is a brilliant idea. I want to write it." And sometimes I will have written it, and then I'll have this epiphany or experience or something within me change, and I'm like, "Oh, that's what I was writing." Or that's what I need to write, or that's what this character is about. And I love that you experience this too. Of like, I'll have a character that I just can't get a read on them. I don't know. I know they're supposed to be in the story. I don't know why. And then I'll experience something in my daily life. Maybe it's like a rehearsal for the musical I'm in or whatever. And I'll see, and I'll go, oh, that's who needs to be, not a particular person, but like this is an element that informs the character, and then they start coming to life and their backstory forms. Like, I'm not doing it. Oh,
Yeah.
I know who this person is now, and then the story starts working. So
And
yeah.
you have to believe in that divine timing as well. And a huge part of my book is about human beings who clear their vessel. I mean, this is my spirituality, so I'm not saying everyone has to believe in it, but I truly feel to fully step into your power, you have to clear your physical vessel. And that includes deconditioning your mind from all of the stuff that society taught you, whether that's imperialism or colonization or the gender norms or religion, whatever it is that society is using to control you, you have to clear it out of your system. You've got to get your body into a zone where you're not dealing with your childhood trauma, because every time you sit down and do something, a lot of that's going to come up. We are never fully healed, but going through the process of dealing with that psychologically is really going to help open your body. And so the way that I see it is we are all vessels of like otherworldly magic, and we are just here to let it flow through us from the ether into the physical world. And that's exactly what my story is about the main character who can do that with the storm magic, but they have to heal themselves in order to, at least to some extent. And I find that, sometimes we just have to go through that stuff in life in order to be able to sit down. And like you said, you meet the right person. Or, for example, in my story, I'm writing a story about like, there, I will say there is a famine, there is like a food shortage, and all of this major stuff that was happening back in 2016, it wasn't happening. And I was thinking to
Yeah.
myself, who wants to read a story about colonization, right? Oh my gosh, look at then
Now it's
and
poignant.
now. Now it
Yeah.
is like the number one topic on Instagram and on social media, because it's happening and we're seeing it happen all over the world. and we're finally stepping up. So I know now, looking back, that story wasn't ready to come out in 2016. It's ready to come out now.
The populace wasn't aware of all the colonization around them, and
Yeah.
and now we're all like, oh,
And so
yeah,
much of what I was writing is like coming to life. And I was like, wow, I don't, like you said, I don't even know why I wrote this thing. But now I know. Now I can see fully why it's in the story.
yeah. And then sometimes you're like, wait, can I see the future?
Always. But like I said, we have so much more power. And when I say magic, I really mean like our connection to something bigger. And we have so much wisdom that we have brought with us from other lives, from our soul lives. And I think we don't give ourselves enough credit that we have the ability to, I'm not saying we're predicting, but at some point we are, in a way. Like, we came here for a reason, so we're going to like fulfill that. Everyone's life is a prophecy to an extent, and we're going to fulfill that while we're here. And so when you start connecting the dots afterwards, you're like, oh, I see how that all came to, but was I psychic? Maybe a little bit. Maybe my soul knew what I was doing, and I, I was just, figuring it out.
Yeah. How about this? Something to close out on.
Oh,
What
the Kickstarter.
advice
Yes.
would you give to other creatives, whether they're new creatives or hardened, battle worn creatives like us, as they're going on in their career?
I would say something along the lines of what I had mentioned earlier, and something you had brought up as well, is like, don't force yourself into creativity. You are a creative for a reason, and creativity comes from life experiences. It comes from lived experiences. It comes from how we deal with those experiences. And all of that is going to play into whatever art you're creating, whether it's writing or painting or design or whatever it is your art form is that those life experiences are going to really shape what you create. And sometimes those projects that you love are going to take a little bit longer because you need to experience that life in order to create it. And I know there's probably writers out there that just make stuff up off the top of their heads, but I think the art that really stands out in this world comes from those lived experiences. And so give yourself the time and the space to live life and to have those and get out there and enjoy and experience the world, not just your country, not just your bubble and your little city and your state. Get out and experience the entire world, and then come back and create something from that space.
I love it. So, people who want to check you out, your work, and Charlie's song, where can people find you?
Yes. So we didn't really talk about it much, but I am doing a Kickstarter. So by the time I think this episode comes out, the Kickstarter is going to be on its last day. However, there is going to be a backer kit a few weeks later where people are going to be able to purchase the collector's edition of Book One, Storm of Desolation. So Charlie's Song is a trilogy with 3 different books. And the first one is called Storm of Desolation. That begins the story. That's what I'm doing the Kickstarter for. And so you
Awesome.
can all find that on my website at transfairyprince.com. That is TransFairyPrince.com. And Transfairy Prince is also my handle on social media on Instagram and TikTok. So if you go over there, you're going to find tons of media and videos and all the links in my bio.
Awesome. Well, Kaedyn, it's been great talking with you. And for everybody listening, thanks for joining us.
Able Voices is a production of the Berkeley Institute for Accessible Arts Education, led by me, Dr. Rhoda Bernard, the founding managing director. It is produced by Daniel Martinez del Campo. The intro music is by Kai Levin, and our closing song is by Sebastian Batista. Kai and Sebastian are students in the arts education programs at the Berkeley Institute for Accessible Arts Education. If you would like to learn more about our work, find us online at berkeley.edu/BIAAE or email us at biaae@berkeley, that's lee.edu.